Hello, my loves, and welcome to Strange Playgrounds once again, and welcome to a very peculiar episode. It's a Strange Playgrounds about Strange Playgrounds. I was actually reading back through the short story collection that this podcast is named after, Strange Playgrounds, which I wrote. The stories I wrote when I was very young, when I was like in my at uni, I was like 21, 22 for the most part, and some of them a little later on, like in bits and pieces. Some of them I started back then and then finished many years later. Some of them were written as part of that project, but the vast majority came about when I first started seriously writing, when I was at university, when I was like 20, 21, 22. And it's a very strange experience because you get a window into who that person was, how they were thinking, how they were feeling. And what's really fascinating is seeing the stuff that they didn't consciously realize. Now, the writing of Strange Playgrounds was really, it's in retrospect, is very fascinating because I don't even know if that kid, if that boy, that 20-year-old, even had like he wanted to be published. That was definitely true. He had aspirations to be a writer, to be an author. But whether he thought he could or not, I don't know. I sincerely don't know. He probably didn't, actually. Given what was going on in his head at the time, he probably didn't. This is what reading it now has demonstrated to me. When I was 20, in my like throughout my 20s, I suffered with some very serious mental health issues, like really quite serious mental health issues. Chronic depression. I mean, like I had no energy for anything. I was so depressed. Social anxiety. Oh my God. Social anxiety that was crippling, that I really, really, really should have gotten help for. I really should have gotten therapy for. Um, I would get on the bus to go to uni and have panic attacks for no reason, like no reason whatsoever. It was absurd. And I remember feeling them coming and thinking, oh, for fuck's sake, will you go away? Leave me alone. Because it's not a conscious thing, it's not a rational thing. You know consciously that this is irrational, that there's no reason for it. You're just on a bus, you're just going to uni, there's nothing to worry about, right? But you feel this rising wave of anxiety and panic, and it just washes over you, and suddenly you can't breathe, suddenly you can't think straight, suddenly your heart's going like 20 miles an hour, and you have to go home. You either collapse or you have to go home. And I did collapse a couple of times actually, which was not best. But what that kid was doing with the stories in Strange Playgrounds, not only was he experimenting and trying to find his voice, as you do at that age, what you're trying to do is establish yourself in your own head. What am I as a creator, as a writer? What is my voice? How is it different from the people who have influenced me? Yeah? Because the other thing you're doing at that age, certainly what I was doing, I wouldn't, presume to speak for anyone else, but what I was doing was consuming just loads of material, just like ravenously. I was getting opened up to new stuff through my uni courses. I did English and English literature and creative writing. So suddenly I had all of these new vistas to explore. I had American literature, and I had new vistas in dark literature and historical literature. So much, which is now very, very well beloved to me. The noir tradition, which I'd never really gone near before, outside of a few niche items. Which I love. I absolutely love. Raymond Chandler. I love that stuff. There's the hard-boiled stuff. That was fascinating. African literature. I did an African literature course, which was amazing. Which was actually it was actually taught by a guy who was from Africa, and he'd been involved in all sorts of really awful things, like just the uprisings and just wars and pogroms, just the most amazing things which this literature derived from. It was just the most amazing, eye-opening, wonderful thing. Feminist literature, again, did a feminist literature course, which I did, I didn't have much access to in and of itself. But suddenly I was reading Charlotte Perkins Gilman, I was reading Virginia Woolf, and it was just so fascinating. The whole thing, it just blew my mind open, and suddenly I was just consumptive. I was going to Waterstones, to the local bookstores, and just buying everything I could afford, effectively, just getting everything I could afford and just consuming it. And that was changing who I was as a person and as an imaginer and as a writer. Because one of the things you're trying to do is move away from your prime influences. You start basically, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, you start emulating. When you first start writing, you start to emulate those voices that you've consumed, the ones that are already in your head. For me, it was the likes of it was Barker, it was Tolkien, it was C.S. Lewis, it was Stephen King, it was that those kinds of writers. Barker principally, and it took me a while to sort of get to the point where I could move away from that, where you try to stop emulating who you admire. Because you read things, I want to do this, I want to make people feel this way, I want to open people's eyes like this. Well, I mean, you will always incorporate elements of those writers. It's unavoidable. You will always do it, but the trick is to use that as a springboard into something more fundamental, personal, and sincere. Something more idiosyncratic, where you're not just trying to reproduce what moved you, where you're not just trying to reproduce what inspired you. You need to find something, a core, an essence that's it's more expressive of who you are and what you're going through at the time. And that's reading back through Strange Playgrounds, that's exactly what's happening. It's so interesting looking back some 20 years later, looking back at what that kid was going through and what he's expressing on the page. It was a form of self-therapy, a form of self-counseling. Healthy or not, I'm not sure. But there's no doubt in my mind that writing those stories, expressing these things, probably saved his life. It probably kept him. I mean, if you read those stories, there's a lot of that stuff in there. There's a lot of characters who are disaffected, characters who are dissatisfied with the world, to the point whereby they end up breaking it, like breaking it open, ripping it open with their despair. There's a lot of people who are outside of systems and who see things that are wrong, that are not functioning, which everyone else seems blind to or just accepts. There's a lot of the world turning inside out, which of course is something that's carried through into all of my fiction. All of my stories deal with that to one degree or another. But there's a lot of mistrust of systems. There's a lot of the sort of stories of the outsider, of the exile, of someone who doesn't fit in, who doesn't feel as though they are where they're supposed to be, and not finding a place but realizing that that is sacred in and of itself. That's a really interesting thing about Strange Playground, and something I'm quite proud of, actually, because it is standard for those kinds of stories, for the exile to find their place, to find somewhere where they do fit in. My stories don't do that. They, particularly those ones, they don't do that. The exiles come to see the romance in their exile. They come to see that their responses are not necessarily irrational to the world in which they're operating, and breaking it, ripping it open, changing it, wounding it to the point of death may actually be a good thing, may actually be the right response. And that initiative, that imperative has actually deepened as I've got older. It's something I've carried through and become more kind of revolutionary about as in my fiction as I've gotten older. But it's interesting to see it germinate in Strange Playgrounds. It's not a collection that's satisfied with a particular state of reality or the world. It doesn't want to, and it doesn't want to re-establish something like a new order either. It's actually not interested in order at all, because it, as I did at the time and still do to a certain degree, sees order as corruption. It sees order as oppression. It sees order as undesirable, in contrast to chaos, which is really fascinating. Really fascinating. There's a kind of like metaphysical revolutionary quality going on there, which is an expression of what I was going through. It's an expression of my dissatisfaction with myself, with my sense of self, with the world at large. I mean, you have to bear in mind what was going on at the time as well. I was becoming very politically active and aware at that time. So I was like, yeah, and what was happening? We'd got Tony Blair's new Labour government, and we were having all of this corruption. We were having the war, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. which we everyone loathed in the UK, by the way. Nobody wanted them, and we were being dragged into them largely as we've discovered since, for very corrupt reasons. You know, for the in order to serve the interests of the already rich, of companies and businesses and people who had very particular political and industrial agendas in that region of the world. We know that now. It's absolutely true. But we knew it at the time as well. We were aware of it as students. And yeah, those protests in London, despite my social anxiety, I was in some of them. And it's there that my mistrust of culture and society and politics deepened to the nth degree, because I saw what the police were doing. And what the police were doing was agitating. They wanted violence. They wanted those protests to get violent. And they were doing everything in their power to make them violent. They were pushing people, they were jabbing at people, they were insulting them, they were trying every means to try and make people react because they wanted violence. Because once there's violence, then they can come down, then they can get violent, and that's how they know how to operate, right? Then they can just oppress the entire thing. That's what they were trying to do. And seeing it firsthand was like, yeah, yeah, this is bullshit. I'm in a world of bullshit, you know? It was that kind of experience that really deepened my exile status, if you like. This sense of as of being an alien in the world amongst humanity, and I've always felt that. A lot of people do. I mean, this is not uncommon, right? This is some. I mean, most teenagers go through this to some degree or other. It's not uncommon. It doesn't make you special or anything like that. It's just that this was my experience at the time. And it just deepened and deepened and deepened. I started to realize I don't see the world in the way most other people do, certainly in the UK. I don't operate with the same assumptions or wants or desires or ambitions. It became very clear to me that it is just systems of corruption and coercion. And people live through them doing what they feel they're supposed to do. So, going to university, getting this job, getting that salary or that amount of money, getting a car, getting a house, blah, blah, having a family. And then they reach like the age of what, 50 maybe, and realize it doesn't satisfy them. It doesn't serve them because they never really wanted to do it. It's not what they really wanted to do. And they were never given a chance to determine what they really wanted to do. And now they're in a place where they feel it's over. It's not. It's not. There's always opportunity to break away from that, but they feel as though it's over. And I saw that at that age. I saw it so much in the older generations, right? My parents' generation. I saw it so much in them, you know. Y- People, there's poverty and whatnot in every generation, but our parents' generation were generally better off and are generally better off than we are, and so on and so forth. And they had, from my perspective, they kind of had everything. I mean, I was a student, I was kind of impecunious. I had little bits and pieces of work, and I had, student loans, but I was poor, basically. I was underclass. And seeing them with everything they want, they got their homes, their jobs, their cars and whatnot, and not being satisfied, not being happy at all. In fact, being the opposite, that fed into it too. That made me realize, you know what? Don't play the game. Do not play the game. The game is rigged. If you are working class or underclass, it doesn't matter. Actually, it doesn't matter. You can be rich as Croesus, and you can still be fundamentally unhappy, as we know from examples amongst our bourgeoisie and our aristocrats and the people who basically own everything. They're never happy. In fact, I would argue that the people who like the richest people on earth are the most empty. I mean, people like J.K. Rowling, who is fucking insane at this point, and Elon Musk, who is just a shell. Just this hollow shell, this vacuum of identity where there is nothing. There is nothing, and it makes him fundamentally unhappy, which is why he acts the way he acts, where he's got to insist upon this superficial identity. Oh, I'm the tech bro, I'm the futurist, I'm this, I'm that, but he doesn't have the chutzpah, the intelligence, the inspiration to carry it through. He just has a very good PR team, because of course he does. He's a quad billionaire, of course he has a good PR team that puts about this myth of himself. But the fact that he doesn't live up to that myth, the fact that he doesn't feel it in himself, is this source of constant frustration. Well, I would say despair, utter, complete, utter despair. It's fascinating, and seeing that as a 20-year-old, as a young man, and realizing that yeah, I could go through university, which I did. You know, I got my degree and everything, and I could carry on in academia, or I could even I could become an author, I could become a writer, and it still probably wouldn't make me. It wouldn't serve what it wouldn't change this state in my mind. It wouldn't change this state in my head because it's so profound and complex for all of us, right? All constantly seem to be searching after this idea of identity, this idea of an ideal of who we want to be, which doesn't exist and never existed. It's always a myth. You're chasing shadows, you're chasing smoke, right? It doesn't exist. And much of it actually comes through our popular fiction. It comes through our mainstream fiction, which always has these blasé pop psychology stories about people finding themselves, realizing some essence of themselves, and being happy after that. And it's just not true. It's a lie. It's a lie we tell to children. That is not what happens. We will find other things. We will find other things to make us unhappy. We will find other things that we need or want or desire, or that we feel we are not living up to. That's the big thing. We weigh ourselves against others, and we look at what they're doing, and we think, oh, if only I was like that, I'd be happy. Oh, if only I could do that, I'd be living up to some prescription of who I am. And it's bullshit. It's utter bullshit. Each of us is floundering in this mire. Each of us, all of us, no matter how ostensibly successful or fulfilled we seem to be, it's kind of superficial. It's pantomimic. It's a performance. There's so much of our cultures is exactly that. It's superficial. It's performative. It's about expressing to an audience what you feel you should be, whether you are that or not. And the internet has not fucking helped in that regard, by the way, because there's very little that's fucking sincere on here. I can tell you, the vast majority of YouTube, of these like podcasts and whatnot, there's very little in the way of sincerity. It's all about projecting a particular image that fulfills the creator. You know, oh, I want to feel as though I'm so smart, so I'll put out this video that says this, that sounds this way. It's all about. It's very rarely about expressing the truth. It's very rarely about expressing something sincere, and it's a real bother. It's a real bother because it's the most superficial videos that get the fucking views. Unfortunately, it's the most produced, the most slick. It's the ones that have the most that are very cynical in terms of the way they're marketed, in the terms of what they do. That's why the algorithm points you so much towards sort of like right wing reactionary videos. It's really, really sad. But that realization of the flux of personality and identity, the fact that we're not fixed, that is what Strange Playgrounds is about. That is what it's about expressing. And part of that realization was through the writing, through that expression. It's so fascinating now to look back at who that boy was and how different things are now. I mean, partially as a result of writing those stories. I don't know what would have happened to him without that outlet, without that self-therapy. Well, I kind of do, because he also suffered with profound suicidal ideation, which, by the way, is still a thing. That is a real thing that I fight with a lot in my own head. Suicidal ideation is a real bitch. It's a real bitch because, like depression, like social anxiety, it's a disease that justifies itself. It makes itself feel rational and reasonable and like the correct response to things. It warps your perceptions so that it seems perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable. And that is the real trick of it. That's the real disease. It's realizing that because it feels correct doesn't necessarily mean that it is correct, right? Because it sounds rational, because it feels rational, doesn't necessarily mean that it is. That's part of the trick of dealing with it. When that demon voice pipes up, or in your head, it's like, oh God, wouldn't it just be nice to just to stop? You've got to, the whole thing is no, fuck you, go fuck yourself. Get out, no. I've got things to do. I have things to do. So, yeah, it's that. It's finding some anchorage. It's finding a position from which to defend yourself, quite frankly, from those whispers, from those little those that demon that pipes up every so often. It's finding some platform from which to say, you're not real. You are not what you proclaim to be. You're a fucking liar, for one thing. That part of you is a fucking liar. Um, and it wants harm for you. That's the weird thing. That part of you wants harm for you. And it's like, you are my enemy. That part of you is an enemy and it needs to fuck off, quite frankly. Which is how I react to it. It's interesting because you'll have heard me throughout this video talking about myself in like the third person, referring to he and him, and that's because I feel that way. I actually, it's how I deal with my history and my past. Part of my psychological techniques, as it were, is by divorcing myself from who I was before. Not totally, because you can't. Obviously, those people are still there. They're ghosts in your head, right? But in very many respects, that boy, that 20-year-old, is dead. Is very dead. I don't recognize him anymore. I can't think like him anymore, and I wouldn't want to. He is a different entity. And Strange Playgrounds is the acknowledgement of that. You will see characters doing that all the way through. But you know what the interesting thing is? I didn't know it. At the time, I didn't know that that is what I was doing. It wasn't conscious. It was just just a natural expression, what came through the stories of what was happening, of what needed to be expressed. And that for me, that's that note of purity I'm always looking for. I don't always succeed. I'm not always successful. I'm not often successful, actually. But that's what I'm looking for. That core, that essence of complete sincerity, because I think that is the truth. That's where good art and good stories always come from. It's when it's visceral, it's when it's that feeling, when it's not just and I've got to do this, I've got to fulfill this, I've got to justify this. No, 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 no. It's when it feels correct. It's when it something sincere is coming through, and you may not even realize what it is. It's just working, it's just flowing, it's just going. That's when it's best, and that's when you get the best work, because it is sincere. It is sincere. For whatever technical faults it might have, it's sincere and it's real and it's true. And that, for me, that's the litmus test. That's what I'm always, always going for. Whether I get it or not, whether I succeed in it or not, that is the thing.